Brian, let me officially welcome you to the virtual summer seminar in entrepreneurship research. We have participants from around the world, 23 countries, the last time I counted, or more specifically, Jasmine counted. The virtual seminar in entrepreneurship research is pleased to host Dr. Brian Anderson, who's an associate dean at University of Missouri at Kansas City, and an associate professor of entrepreneurship. Dr. Anderson has a PhD from the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University. Those of you who are not as familiar with Indiana University, in 2016, we did some research that found that Indiana is among the top 2 or 3 universities in terms of entrepreneurship research productivity. Depending on how you count productivity, it was either number 1, number 2, or number 3. So he graduated from, the top ranked program in entrepreneurship research. He's a field editor at Journal of Business Venturing. And as a field editor, I know that Brian has been, actively sort of engaged in improving the method standards in entrepreneurship research. And before coming into academia, Dr. Anderson has worked in the public and the private sector, and he also serves in the National Guard of the state of Colorado, which for those of you who are outside the US, think of it as sort of the defense services, but not the National Army, but the defense services. The reason I mention this is to make the point that if you look at Dr. Anderson's record, he has worked in the public sector, the private sector, the defense, and in academia. So, Brian, welcome.
Thanks, Prasad. That could also mean that I'm a little bit scattered, but
like
but like entrepreneurship researchers, right? You're always on the hunt for new opportunity.
True.
And opportunity can exist everywhere.
True. So let me start with the first question. How did you get interested in entrepreneurship research after such a varied career? Sort of what brought you to entrepreneurship research and business PhD?
No, that's a great question. So one of the things that I did in the private sector was being an entrepreneur. But like a wide number of entrepreneurs, I experienced entrepreneurial failure in a spectacular way. And by spectacular, what I mean is this was back during the .com era. For some of you who are not getting quite as old in the tooth as Vishal and I are, this was the late 90s when barriers to entry were low and opportunities abounded. And I took a shot and was involved in a number of technology startups, none of which hit it big, one of which failed spectacularly. But it was a wonderful experience. I would never do it again. But I learned a lot in the process. And I think that was where I kind of fell in love with entrepreneurship. And then, made my way back to, because I had left university to go and do the startups, found my way back to school, and then started a graduate program at the University of Denver. And it was there that I connected with some faculty mentors who, introduced me to research. Not in terms of actively participating in research, but just a career in academia. And I bring this up because mentorship is such a powerful tool, but a powerful impact on how we shape lives. And I think that's such a wonderful part about being in academia and being a professor, being a faculty member, is the opportunity to work with students and help them discover their own life journey. And so for me, it was just wonderful faculty mentors while I was working on my master's degree that exposed me to what a career in academia could be like. And it was one of those mentors, Don Berg, who is a very active researcher in the strategic management field, that suggested that I take a look at Indiana. And Vishal, thank you for that kind introduction to the Kelley School. It was the best decision that I could have made. Not only is Indiana, a very productive place that provides, outstanding training for researchers, it was a wonderful culture, a wonderful environment. My chair was Professor Jeff Coven, who, in addition to being, one of the, if not, the leading light in the entrepreneurial orientation space, also happens to be a ridiculously good person, and was just a wonderful mentor to me, and is still a very close friend, and somebody whose counsel I appreciate so much. So those experiences were very formative of me. My PhD is actually in strategy, but with Jeff, he really exposed me to that strategic entrepreneurship space. So that intersection point between strategic management and entrepreneurship, and I just fell in love with it. It is really what it came down to. There was something about the topic and the problems that were very appealing to me, and then entrepreneurial orientation being something that Jeff obviously does a lot of work on.
नहीं मैं तो चाहिए तो मैं जो लेना ले लो
Sorry, I think we're talking over each other. What was that? Did somebody have a question?
No,
Happy to interrupt anytime.
That was just some background noise from
gotcha.
one of the
worries.
participants. Sorry about that.
No worries. But that was where I got my exposure to entrepreneurial orientation, and just really fell in love with the topic. The interest in research methods came along, a little bit later, really more as I was working on my dissertation, and beyond. But that's kind of my personal journey towards entrepreneurship.
Cool. So my second question is, you've published so many papers in entrepreneurship research. Can you briefly share with us the trajectory from origin to publication of one of your entrepreneurship sort of methods-oriented papers?
Yeah, sure. So, I think of myself primarily as an entrepreneurial orientation researcher, but with my passion being research design and empirics. And for me, I don't come from a classical mathematics and statistics background. I do come from a programming background. And I think as, really in the last decade, we've seen this fundamental shift in data science and analytics to more of what I would consider to be a programmatic or computational frame that is supported by a mathematics and statistics kind of background, as opposed to the opposite. Today, when we talk about teaching statistics in a business school, the conversation is about R and Python and replicability and using software tools to tell a data story. Even 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we would have been talking about being at a chalkboard and, okay, let's do this derivative by hand. And, fortunately, we've moved past that. But I think that evolution has really helped me, because coming from, a technology background, it was very easy for me to adopt new methods, that leverage more of a computational or programmatic approach to statistics. And so as that kind of evolved, and just kind of being passionate about research design and empirics, it's allowed me to use entrepreneurial orientation as a backdrop to tell a methodological story. And so I think of myself very much as an applied statistics or applied research design scholar. I don't do a lot of work on the underlying, mathematical properties of estimators or things like that. A lot of my work is figuring out how to empower other researchers to leverage emerging tools to help them tell their stories better. So, in an analogous way, it's the story going, when there's a gold rush, you could either mine for gold or you can sell shovels to the miners. And so I think of myself as selling the shovels, helping other researchers do their research better. So, a recent paper that does this, we just published it, Patrick Kreiser and Bill Wales and myself, and let's see, I've got to look at it and see who all was on it, because one of the questions was the the team. And so it was Patrick, no, Bill was not on this one. Patrick, myself, Don Krakow, and Lou Marino. And it's entrepreneurial orientation and environmental hostility, a threat rigidity perspective, and it was published last year in ET&P. And I bring up this paper because the origins of this paper date back almost to 2010. So this project took almost 10 years from when we first thought of the idea to publication. It was rejected at, I'm going to miss a couple of journals in there because it was rejected so often. I mean, SMJ, JBV, Org Science, Management Science. I mean, this paper was universally hated until finally we sent it as the last straw. Like, well, let's send it to ET&P and see what happens. And fortunately, we caught a lucky break by an editor, and I'll come back to that lucky break from an editor, who basically said, okay, I kind of like the story, but the research design and empirics are awful. So you're going to need to figure something out. And the reality was the editor was right. We hadn't gone back and updated the empirics, in 7-8 years. And so for me, it was a chance to say, okay, let's start over again. What is it that we need to communicate to reviewers and readers of this paper such that they're going to be able to leverage what we do in this measurement model and in this measurement approach that's going to help them do their research better? And for me, it was, okay, EO is kind of this firm level construct. It's business level strategy. It's product market spaces, right? And we have psychometric instruments that do a great job at tapping into EO and related constructs. What we don't have is something at the corporate strategy level that would be similar in use and conceptualization. There is text analysis based measures, but I wasn't wild about that. And I wasn't wild about it, not because I think that the method is flawed, but because I thought it was tapping something different. It was tapping more about how managers talk about EO, maybe more dispositional or attitudinal. And so I wanted to say, okay, how could we look at the measurement approach differently? And then how can we give others a template to follow for building on this paper in future research? And so where we ended up is a measurement model that draws on secondary financial indicators, addresses what I think are some limitations of some earlier work in this space, but then motivating why we think this measurement model makes sense when you look at EO from this particular way. And this was important, and Vishal and I have done some work on this and others of, look, it's not that different research designs and measurement models and approaches are inherently good or bad or right or wrong. They work well in particular circumstances, and you need to align those circumstances with how you want to approach research design and measurement, right? And it starts with conceptual knowledge of the space. You have to have a really good insight of what it is that you're trying to capture. And so for me, it was, okay, I knew I wanted to do something behavioral, something at the corporate side. So I had to start there, build my argument around it, but then show how you do this empirically. And so in the paper, what we ended up with is a robust documentation that we put on the Open Science Foundation website that has all of our code and the justification for, okay, if you're going to approach it this way, basically we're handing the template over to other researchers. This is how you do this. This is how, not just this is how you write the code, but this is why you do the things that we did in the paper. Now you can choose not to do those things, and that's fine. You just need to say, here's how we approached it differently. And that ended up becoming an important part of the contribution of the paper, or the word, I'm not wild about the phrase contribution, just personally. I think about it more in terms of usefulness. Is a contribution being, is this something that another researcher can pick up and use in his or her work to do their work better, right? And that was this empirical approach, because it filled a gap, seemed to be a real key to the usefulness of the paper. And I see that the problem faced with publication, yeah, it was brutal, right? I mean, rejection after rejection after rejection, and at a certain point in time, it's like, okay, clearly people hate this idea. Right? So how do we think about this differently? And it took time, but I think it was worth the investment. But I think it speaks to the necessity of persistence, right? We talk about persistence for entrepreneurs. Our field, in so many ways, is set up to beat you down. And I don't mean that necessarily in the pejorative, but the acceptance rate at JBV is now 5%, right? I mean, in all odds, you're going to get rejected far more than you get acceptance. And when you look at scholars that have long successful CVs, like Vishal, what you don't see in that are the dozens of rejections that went along with all of those acceptances. I'll tell you a little anecdote. Dean Shepard, when he was still the editor at JBV, we happened to be at I think it was Academy or Babson or something, and a younger researcher went up to him, and she was upset because he had just rejected a paper, and she came up and she just walked right up to him, and Professor Shepard, you just rejected my paper. And without skipping a beat, he says, you know what? I bet I've been rejected more than you have. And it stopped the conversation. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, right? Persistence, but having comfort and confidence in the story that you want to tell and making it useful for others.
And Brian, we have some questions coming from the audience, but we'll hold off on them until we go through the 4 questions I have for you. So
sure.
This is sort of your perspective as an author, but what about as an editor? How do you decide if a paper has potential or not? Persistence, I'm assuming, is not the only thing that gets one in, right? You have to have some potential. So how do you decide that?
No, that's a good question. Okay, so I'm an editor at Journal of Business Venturing. So I've been an editor now for, gosh, I guess 4 years. I handle papers related to EO and strategic entrepreneurship. I also handle what Jeff McMullen, who is the editor-in-chief, calls the quirky methods papers. So, and these are papers where a researcher has done applied a research design or an empirical approach that is not very common in the field, and he leaves it to me to figure it out, which is fun and irritating all at the same time. So let me kind of dispel, I think, a couple of myths to start this question, because I think it is a really important question. So a couple of myths. One, editors and journals generally do not favor certain empirical or theoretical approaches over another, right? Vishal was talking about, if you're interested in qualitative research, great. Do it because you like it, because you're passionate about it, because that's the one that you want to use. Don't do it because you think that that's going to help me speak to XYZ editor and get me published. That's not the way it works. Journals and editors are interested in publishing good research that asks interesting questions, that engages researchers, and has the potential to have impact. That's what journals are after. All right. So myth number 2, on that, the data is the most important, or the empirics are the most important, or the rigor is the most important. It's important, it's not the most important. The secret, in my opinion, is it's not the data, it's not the theoretical contribution, it's not the gap, it's the writing. Can you tell an engaging story that is such that a reviewer and an editor and future readers want to read your paper? And this is, I think, one of the most challenging parts of higher education as a field of academia, because it is true across disciplines. The ability to write well, to write clearly, to identify an important idea, build an argument around that, build a cogent argument, a logically consistent argument, and an engaging argument. That's the X factor.
And before you move to myth number 3, I have a clarification question.
Sure.
And the clarification question is, when you say writing is the most important and research methods is not, when we started today's session with the participants, we used power pose as an example of good story, but flawed research methods, so came crashing down. I'm assuming you are not saying that's the way we should be, the power pose kind of research.
Yeah, no, Vishal, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. So here, and that's an important clarification. Thank you, Vishal. No, it's not to say that a great story and shoddy research is the ticket, right? But really well done and well executed research surrounded by a story that is poorly communicated, that doesn't work. And that's why I say that the writing is so critical, because you could invest so much time in research design, data collection, empirics, and if you can't tell that story well or effectively, then you're going to find a very difficult road to publish. Now, that doesn't mean that poorly written papers don't get published, because we've all read papers where, including in some of our best journals, where just, good God, this thing is boring. And I cannot believe somebody actually not just wrote this, but published it. So, I mean, there's a lot of bad writing out there, right? But where I tell folks, the nice thing about knowing that writing is so critical to success in the field is that everybody can learn to be a better writer. I mean, that's, there is a mechanics to writing effectively, and that writing, or those mechanics, can be learned, practiced, and honed. So everybody can do it. And that's what I think is really important to take away from it, is even if your writing is not at the level that you would like it to be, with hard work, energy, effort, a great attitude, you can get better at it. And the other piece of it is, this is a lifelong journey, right? The quest to become a better writer. I think I'm a better writer today than I was 10 years ago, but that still doesn't mean that I feel like I'm a great writer, right? That I've hit it, I've mastered it. That's not the case at all. And so, I think that piece, knowing that you can learn to be a better writer is really important for your own professional development. Right? So the third piece is, you hear this a lot of, you need a senior scholar or a senior researcher or a big name on a paper, and that's going to get the attention of the editor, and they're going to be more likely to publish the paper. This, in my mind, is a classic endogeneity problem. And by that, what I mean are senior scholars more likely to be published because they're a senior scholar and they have name recognition or relationship with the editor, or are they more likely to be published because they know how to publish? And here's the misattribution of thinking that, well, the editor is going to favor, a senior scholar, because they're a big name, it's going to be influential and so forth. I'd say just the opposite. They got to be a senior scholar because they put the time, effort, and energy into developing their writing skills, understanding how to craft meaningful arguments, pursuing interesting research questions, learning how to really frame and communicate questions in such a way that it's engaging. And so I say that to say, it's a great opportunity to partner and look for opportunities to partner with senior scholars in research initiatives and programs. But what you should take from that is not, gosh, if I pair up with Vishal, we're going to be more likely to get into AMJ, which he has done. It's no, I've got an opportunity to partner with Vishal and learn how to do this. How do I craft a meaningful introduction? How do I frame my hypothesis in such a way that I am engaging the relevant literature, right? It's a process-based, not an outcome-based approach. So I think those are kind of three myths that I like to highlight, about publishing. And so all of that being said, how I approach a paper is different from how other editors approach a paper. For me, I'm asking kind of three questions. I handle mostly empirical papers. I don't handle conceptual papers. One, because I've never written one, and I mean, if I did, I'd probably be bad at it, because you think of folks like Greg Fisher and others who have been exceptionally successful in publishing those kind of papers. I think there's a different approach to the crafting a contribution, and that's not a skill set that I have. So for empirical papers, I'm looking, do they cross a particular threshold for rigor? And that threshold changes depending upon the empirical design and the approach. But are they at least approaching the standards in our field? And this is where, I couldn't help but chuckle, Vishal, at your comment and counsel about, back with a single source study. As a field, we've moved past that as an appropriate design to test theory. It doesn't mean that you can't use that method, right? There could be settings in which it's very appropriate to collect that kind of data and that kind of source. But from a theory testing standpoint, that one and done kind of survey, that's not, that doesn't rise to where the field is at right now. So for me, I'm looking at, for whatever design the researchers have applied, does it approach where we are at as a field? And the challenge being that that bar is getting higher, and it's, I don't know that I would say it's an exponentially increasing bar, but it is certainly, a positive linear trend, and that's a good thing. I mean, we want to keep adopting, rigorous methods, be pursuing, taking advantage of new developments in measurement theory, in empirics, in computation that allows us to pursue more rigor in our design. So that's kind of the first thing. Did they get close? The second is the writing. And what I mean by that is the easiest way to get a rejection desk rejection or reviewer rejection is if the writing is poor. And it's if it's hard for the reviewer to follow the argument, if they have to come back, I read your introduction, I still don't understand the question that you are asking. I don't understand the conversation that you are trying to engage with. It's just not going to work. And so for me, there is a writing bar that is admittedly very subjective. It's absolutely subjective. But I'm using my experience as an editor to say, okay, are we close such that the writing and the argumentation is sufficiently strong enough that reviewers are going to be able to look to the theory, look to the empirics to see some promise in the paper. And then the third one then is, is the paper grounded in a meaningful conversation? And this is where I differ a little bit from the notion of a theoretical contribution, because for me, a contribution is very much in the eye of the beholder. What is a contribution to me may not be a contribution for you. I certainly don't have experience in a wide variety of literatures. I know the EO literature really well, but even then, there's EO papers that I've never seen before, or I might have read years ago, and oh, I should probably read that one again. And so for me as an editor, are you engaging an audience in a meaningful way, such that people that are interested in that conversation might find your paper useful? And so let me kind of illustrate one just from the EO literature. The EO performance relationship has been studied a lot, right? Now, it's been studied from a correlational frame, right? I mean, not from a causal inference frame. But even though, there's endogeneity concerns, other piece of it, if a paper came forward and said, hey, we're just going to do a really robust test of the EO firm performance relationship. Well, I mean, okay, you might have applied a more rigorous method, and for me, I love that, right? But you haven't really helped advance the conversation. And I think this is important when we think of research methods and research method inspired papers. Just investigating a relationship in a more rigorous way doesn't necessarily make the paper useful. Now, you could say, look, the way that everybody has been testing this relationship is fundamentally flawed because of X, Y, and Z. They misapplied the method, or they misunderstood something, and we need to look at it this way. And we do that, the relationship changes completely. Oh, all right. Well, that could be a very useful insight. But nonetheless, it has to be motivated by a meaningful conversation. And this is where I think that usefulness frame is helpful. Is another researcher going to find this paper useful? Because ultimately our audience is scholars, right? I mean, that's the research that we pursue. So that was a very long answer to your question, Rasal, but that's how I tend to approach it as an editor.
That's a very good and thorough response, Brian. I appreciate it. There's so many questions coming from the audience. So instead of going to my fourth question, we are going to just move to the audience.
Sure.
Skylar, do you want to ask your question? Skylar?
Okay, thank you, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thank you, Professor, and thanks for sharing. I have a question about the new research methods, and I agree with you, the research contribution goes first, but when it comes to the new research methods, for example, when we introduce new research methods to entrepreneurship research, I mean, the method is necessary, it matches with the research question, but how could we better communicate the new methods to the audience of entrepreneurship? As a senior editor, could you please share with us some of your expectations or suggestions. That must be inspirational to hear. Thank you.
So Skylar, that's a great question. Real quick, in case you happen to hear some pounding coming through, they're doing some work outside of my office here at the university, and so it's a little loud. Sorry, but Skylar, this is a great question, and we often think of, how do we draw from other literatures things that might be very well established in other fields, but aren't necessarily, something that is common in our field. And I have a little bit of experience, with this in some of the early, endogeneity wars, if you will, of where, it was very well accepted in economics and econometrics, and, in our field, strategy management field broadly, endogeneity just wasn't part of the conversation. And then some other, areas like Bayesian inference, which is well established in other areas, but kind of different here. I mean, Skylar, you mentioned, latent growth curve modeling and so forth. I think the positioning becomes very important, and I just want to kind of come back to this usefulness frame. And I think the question, or the motivation to kind of cross that bar is not to simply to say, okay, here is a method that this field has used and we can use it over here. That's not enough. I think what you need to motivate is to say, here's this method, and it's been overlooked in our field. And here's this set of research questions that we have. And we're struggling to answer these questions because the tools that we're using don't let us address the issues that we really want to unpack in these relationships. And so for entrepreneurship researchers, if we take this method, we can answer these questions that are going to help us advance our field. And here's how we're going to do that. Right? So it's to speak to the idea that we've got some things in the field that we're still struggling to figure out. We want to ask some tough questions, and there are tough questions that remain in entrepreneurship. So I'm a more macro person, but you think of something like entrepreneurial intentions. I mean, we've been talking about this for decades, trying to unpack what it is that really makes an entrepreneur go start a business. It's still a bit of a black box, right? And so could there be methods out there that could be applied to some of those questions that would really allow us to advance the field? I think that's the bar, Skylar, that we have to cross in applying those new methods. What do entrepreneurship researchers get by doing something in a different way, even if it's something that has well been established in another field? It's got to be connected to to our field and interesting questions in our field.
Thank you, Brian. Mike Blackwell, do you want to go next?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Gupta. And good morning, Dr. Anderson. I appreciate it so much you being here today. As someone who up until just recently was teaching high school students AP statistics, and it was dual credit for community college credit, we often talked about good research design and about how you could torture the data too, about how you could take your p-value, and if you exclude or include, you could have a p-value of 0.06 or 0.04, and so on. You could cross a threshold. So what I'm really curious about then, as someone who's getting into a doctoral program, very interested in entrepreneurship research, is that as I take a look, that we know that things that are novel and innovative tend to get published more. Yet we also want to do reliability, that people can come back and be valid. So where would you think might be areas that are interesting to explore that are cutting edge on entrepreneurship research, and what sort of methods, like you mentioned about longitudinal studies, for example, might be good? To go back to your gold mining example, as someone who sells shovels, where do you think is a good place to go mine for gold, and what kind of shovel should I use for the mining?
That's a great way to flip the analogy, Mike. Let me engage in some ridiculously shameless self-promotion. and say that Carl Venberg and I, he was a fellow editor at JBV. He has now moved from JBV to ET&P. He and I wrote an editorial on this that was published in 2019, and Jeff McMullen joined us because we wanted to kind of tackle just this question, Mike, of, okay, the replication crisis, desire for reproducibility. We want to increase the rigor of our research, but one of the hallmarks of entrepreneurship, the thing that we did not want to lose, is we did not want to place rigor on so high a pedestal such that we lost the phenomenological connection to our field and the passion that researchers have for entrepreneurship. I mean, it's exciting. I mean, could you imagine researching accounting? I mean, holy cow, right? I mean, entrepreneurship changes the world. I mean, you can't imagine a more impactful tool than entrepreneurship to completely change the trajectory of an individual to a nation. I mean, this is an exciting field that draws people to it. But how do we hold on to that while still pursuing high quality science? And so where we tried to communicate, and we'll see, Mike, whether we've been successful in doing this, but what we tried to communicate is it has to start with an interesting question. You cannot discount how important it is to be asking an interesting question. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's got to be a strong theoretical contribution to say, okay, well, look, the next big thing is we're going to apply, I don't know, resource dependency theory, which is 50 years old, to Bitcoin. Like, I mean, could that be an interesting question? Sure. I don't know a lot about Bitcoin, and I don't know a lot about resource dependency theory. Could it be interesting? Maybe. It's up to you to motivate why it's interesting. But it has to start there, Mike. It has to start with, are you asking an interesting question? And this is where you need to be grounded in a literature, such that you really are familiar with the conversations that are happening in the space, and what are some of the contemporary researchers talking about in that area. So, in your PhD program, you'll never have the same opportunity professionally to engage with a wide variety of topics. You'll be exposed to all kinds of different literatures and questions and ideas, and that's wonderful. But it's really hard to kind of develop an area when you're engaging in more of a survey cross-section. And that's where the dissertation comes into play. Okay, I'm going to take a deep dive in this area. And at the end of the dissertation, you really should be a global expert in that question. Now, it's going to be that big, but it should be that deep, right? And so, I think editors often get asked this question, and I've heard, Jeff McMullen answer this, all the time, is, well, where's the field going? What are the interesting things? Where should I spend my time research? And his answer is always the same. I don't know. Because, what's going to be interesting 3 years from now, because that's when your work is going to get published, right? You think about the length of time in the review process. I've got to conceive of an idea. I need to develop a research model. I need to figure out the mechanisms associated with that model. Then I need to go and collect data. And the expectations for data collection today are so much greater. And then I need to write it up, and then I need to send it off to be published, and it's got to go through the review process. It's probably going to be rejected. And so, 5 years from now, who knows? But this is where I think, it starts with, am I asking an interesting question? And then the corresponding, you asked about, what shovel should I use? And it's the shovel that best aligns with the question. And so, for example, take the take entrepreneurial orientation, for example. All right, so firm level, it's a business level strategy construct and so forth. Okay, well, what are the appropriate methods to test it? Well, we could use a survey design. Okay, but we know that that's not going to be enough. All right, so we need to do something more. Well, I could use a survey to kind of do an initial test of a model. Could be appropriate. To that, okay, well, maybe this is related to decision making. Maybe I'm looking at something leadership and EO, for example. Okay, so I might start with a survey. To that, I'll add maybe a conjoint experiment to say, okay, now, all right, I want to take advantage of a little bit more rigorous design. I'm going to ask the question this way. To that, perhaps maybe I'll take advantage of some secondary data and ask the question a little bit different way. And the story that I'm going to try to tell is to say, okay, I've looked at this question 3 different ways, knowing that no one method really allowed me to unpack what I really wanted to unpack. But when I put it together, I can tell the story that says, I've used appropriate rigor in these areas. I've tried to maximize the strengths across these mixed methods, and the net result being is here is a test of a theory, right? So I think having that understanding of which research designs align well with which questions becomes pretty useful in your own development. Now that being said, Mike, I would say that there are a couple of things that are going to be universally helpful as you think about building a research career in terms of technologies. First would be data visualization. Being able to leverage some emerging tools. I mean, could be R, could be. I mean, there's Tableau. I mean, huge number of visualization tools, but we're seeing more papers that are being submitted with exceptionally high quality graphics, and it just adds so much richness to the discussion. And so developing that skill set, I think, is going to be something that pays dividends over time. Other technologies that I think are helpful. If you are interested in more kind of secondary data sources, and others, developing skill sets related to multi-level modeling and, software platforms that do that well. And so R, Python, Stata, tools that are very well equipped to, handle those kind of models in a more rigorous way. So I think that's a useful skill set to develop. If you're more on the experimental design, perhaps interested in more micro level research and so forth, really investing in experimental design, analyzing experimental data, but kind of going beyond what might be kind of an SPSS kind of point and click methodology. And I don't mean that to criticize SPSS. Well, I mean, I kind of am. But really investing the time. Okay, I need to learn this at a pretty deep level so that I'm really well equipped to understand how to analyze this data well. So I think those are some approaches that you can invest in. The reality is, though, you will not be an expert on all methods. That's impossible. And the literature on research design and methods is advancing so quickly that it's exceptionally difficult to keep up. For me, I've shifted primarily to Bayesian, and so Bayesian just kind of speaks to me a little bit, and so I'm spending a lot of time just kind of being immersed in that literature and going on that. And that's a pivot for me because I kind of started more with a structural equation modeling, psychometric kind of frame, and I shifted a little bit. but it also means that my structural equation modeling skills are rapidly deteriorating. And that's kind of a trade-off that you make. I mean, it's just challenging to keep up. But it was a great question.
Brian, as we move towards the end of this session, because our next guest speaker is also waiting and we are also past time, the time that we promised you. I wanted to say two things, and then I wanted to ask the last participant to ask a question. The two things I wanted to say was, the comment you made about accounting research does not reflect the official policy of the virtual summer seminar in entrepreneurship research. So I want to make that very clear. And second, your editorial, Anderson, Weinberg, Macmillan, Enhancing Quantitative Theory Testing Entrepreneurship Research, was our required reading for today. So they've read that. They've read that paper for today's class.
I hope you guys found it useful.
Yes, very good. Jadwiga, do you want to ask the last question for today?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for all the insights. I have actually two questions, if we can squeeze maybe short, hopefully. The first one is, how does one find theoretical framing for the research? So we are focusing today on research methods, but I think alignment between theory and methodology could be something that we can learn from. And the second one would be, can one use the same data set to measure the dependent variable for two articles if one is telling different stories and building different studies for each article? I found conflicting opinions out there and would really appreciate your thoughts on this. Thank you so much.
No, you bet. So let me address your second question first. Journals vary in their data reuse policies. I will say that while data reuse was very common, even 5 years ago, I think the bar is getting higher to show how different data sets are the same data set is being used in multiple ways for different papers. What I would suggest is this: in the cover letter to the editor, when you submit the paper, carefully lay out how this data collection was conducted, why it's being used for multiple papers, how it might differ from others. But I think you also need to clarify why the paper is robust to concerns over p-hacking. And so it could be the case where, look, this was a multi-year research program. The original grant, for example, was these three models. The data collection all happened together, but they're all very different. I mean, it's just telling that story to say, look, we didn't just collect this data and now we're just mining it for the purpose of finding a hypothesis. So I think that's pretty important. You can always, and this is good counsel, you can always reach out to editors and editors-in-chiefs of journals to ask those kind of questions before you submit a paper. They're happy to do it and happy to answer questions before you submit. Now, what they won't do is, hey, do you think my paper will get published if I submit it here? That you can't do that. But what you can do, I want to be very clear about the data reuse policy at the journal. Here's my situation. Would this be appropriate? And perfectly fine to do. On the theoretical question, so I could not agree with you more. The alignment, because this is the interpretational confounding problem, right? Where the theoretical model and framing does not align with the research design and the empirics employed. So it's very, very critical. For me, I don't think of myself as a strong theory person. So, that's kind of a weakness in my own scholarly development. And so I would suggest that you ask this question to a lot of different folks. What I would say, I'll answer this from an editor standpoint. And I'm not as concerned about the theory that has been applied as I am about the research question itself and whether the theory aligns with the question. You know, I mean, if you're going to apply, you know, I'll pick research dependency theory just because we were picking on it a little bit, right? If you're going to apply that question, but you're going to say, okay, I'm only going to look within a firm to kind of internal power dynamics. Well, I mean, you know, RDT speaks to power, but it's really power in the external environment. It's not really power inside. And so, you know, okay, you could apply this, but does it really make sense to? You know, it's kind of just because you could doesn't mean that you should, right? So I think, you know, how you motivate the argument and motivate why you chose that theory and why it's appropriate to ask that question, I think that's the critical piece. So I know we're out of time. I'm going to just put my my email on here. I think I did it right. Feel free to drop me an email. I'm on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with me, and I'm happy to answer other questions. I know there were several other questions that we didn't quite get time to, but I'm happy to help any way that I can.
Thank you, Brian. I really appreciate it. And before we let you go, is there any one advice you would like to give aspiring scholars?
Right. Just keep writing and get feedback on your writing. And by feedback, I don't mean touchy-feely feedback. I mean, you know, Simon Cowell feedback. You know, somebody who's going to say, this is the worst piece of writing that I have ever seen before, ever, but here's how you need to fix it. That's the feedback that you need.
On that note, thank you very much, Brian. We truly appreciate your taking the time to talk to us today. My pleasure. Vishal, always great to see you, my friend. And thanks so much for the questions, and good luck, everybody. Thank you, Brian. Bye-bye.